Out here, it's not just about the hunt, it's about survival. These stories from seasoned hunters take a dark turn when nature strikes back. From razor-tusked boars to silent cougars and relentless bears, these are the close calls that every hunter dreads. No cell service, no backup, just instinct, grit, and a loaded rifle, sometimes not even that. These are stories you never forget. September in northern British Columbia was as wild and untamed as it had ever been. The dense forest echoed with the sounds of distant winds and the occasional bird call, the kind that only a true hunter could recognize. Thomas Gray, a seasoned hunter in his mid-50s, had spent decades in these woods tracking moose and other game with a steady hand and keen eye. His .30 .06 bolt-action rifle had never let him down before, and it wasn't going to now, he told himself. He had always trusted his gear and his experience, but nothing could prepare him for the brutal reality of a grisly encounter. The day had started like any other, tracking moose signs along the thick underbrush near the river, heading further into the wild where few dared to tread. The season was perfect, the air crisp, and the scent of pine and wet earth filled his lungs. He had already passed a few old moose trails, but none fresh enough to give chase. His boots crunched on the damp forest floor, a rhythm that had comforted him through years of solo hunting trips. Thomas paused, squatting low, scanning the area through his binoculars. There, on the edge of the clearing, he saw it. The unmistakable signs of moose tracks, fresh and deep in the soil. His heart quickened with the excitement of the hunt, and he moved silently, pulling his rifle close, his every step deliberate. He was used to the isolation of these woods, having spent countless days alone, but something felt off today. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. A crack of a branch behind him made his muscles tense. He spun, his rifle aimed instinctively, but the forest was still. The moment passed, and he cursed under his breath. No more distractions. He returned to his task, but the nagging feeling of being observed refused to leave him. He scanned the trees, looking for movement, for any sign of the creature that might be trailing him. Nothing. Just the haunting stillness of the forest. As he continued his trek deeper into the thicket, the scent of something musky and unfamiliar drifted on the wind. It wasn't the sharp tang of moose or deer, it was something different, something dangerous. Then he heard it. A rustle not far ahead, followed by a heavy thud of something large moving through the underbrush. His heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly what it was. The unmistakable growl echoed from the dense thicket, a sound that made every instinct in his body scream to flee. But he couldn't, not now. The moose was close, he had to make the shot. He ducked low and moved quickly, hoping to find some cover before the creature appeared. He knew grizzlies well. He knew how fast they could charge, how powerful they were, but he also knew that they were territorial. And this was their land. His land, too, but he had never been this close to a bear in full aggression, and this one felt different. Larger, meaner. The ground shook beneath his feet, and then he saw it, a massive shape emerging from the shadows of the forest. Its coat was a mix of dark brown and muddy black, rippling with muscle as it moved with a terrifying speed. Its eyes locked onto him, and for a split second everything else disappeared. He was staring at a creature that could tear him apart in seconds. The bear charged, faster than he could have ever anticipated. Thomas barely had time to raise his rifle before the grizzly was on him. His shot went wild, grazing the bear's shoulder, but it did nothing to slow it down. The rifle felt useless in his hands. The bear slammed into him with the force of a freight train, sending him crashing into a thick patch of alder. Pain exploded in his chest, and he gasped for air as he tried to push himself up. But the bear was already on him, jaws snapping, claws swiping through the air like a blur. He shoved his rifle between them, the bear's powerful paws slamming down onto the barrel with such force that it felt like the rifle would snap in half. Thomas managed to push the bear back for a moment, but it was relentless. He could hear the growl building in its throat as it circled, eyes burning with rage. His mind raced, trying to find any possible escape. The bear was on top of him again before he could react. He managed a desperate shot. This time it struck the bear in the side, but it only enraged it further. The massive creature roared in fury, its claws tearing through his jacket and deep into his flesh. Thomas gritted his teeth, refusing to give in. He had faced predators before, but nothing like this. Blood poured from the gash in his side as he fought to reload, but his hands were slick with it, and his rifle felt like a dead weight in his arms. He fired again, but the bullet didn't even slow the bear down. It was a mere irritation to the beast. The rifle was useless. Adrenaline surged through his body as he managed to scramble out from under the bear for a brief moment. He stumbled back, reaching for his knife, but it was no use. The bear was too close. It was only a matter of time before it tore him apart. Then the grizzly hesitated. It stopped, just for a moment, sniffing the air. Thomas took the chance. With all the strength he could muster, he pushed himself to his feet and stumbled backward, keeping his eyes fixed on the bear. He was in agony, but his survival instinct kicked in. His thoughts were clear now. Get to higher ground. The bear growled, but it didn't pursue him immediately. Thomas stumbled toward a large rock outcrop just a few yards away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew the bear would follow, but he had to make it to the rocks. If he could just get there, maybe he had a chance. He was almost there, his legs trembling beneath him, when the grizzly charged again. It roared in fury, but just as quickly as it had charged, it halted. Thomas reached the rock outcrop, pulling himself up with all his remaining strength. The bear was just out of reach now, pacing back and forth below him, its eyes never leaving him. For what felt like hours, Thomas stayed there, watching the bear's every movement. His chest heaved with exhaustion and pain, but he held on. Eventually, the bear lost interest, retreating back into the woods, its growls fading into the distance. But Thomas didn't move. He couldn't, not yet. It was only when he heard the distant sound of a helicopter approaching that he allowed himself to relax. He had survived, but just barely. His rifle had been useless, and yet somehow he had made it out alive. The grizzly had proven one thing: no matter how experienced you were, some creatures could never be fully controlled. Some things were simply too wild and too powerful. The mountain range in southwestern Colorado was cloaked in fog when Kyle Jenkins stepped into the timberline, bow in hand. It was late October, rifle season for elk in Colorado, but he and his teenage son Ryan preferred archery. They had drawn tags for this rugged unit after years of trying, and Kyle had no intention of wasting the opportunity. He was 46, with 2 decades of elk hunting behind him, and carried a Hoyt compound bow and a Glock 20 on his hip, more as a precaution than a necessity. The wilderness demanded respect, and Kyle knew how quickly things could go wrong in remote terrain. Ryan trailed behind quietly, mimicking his father's steps. They had left camp well before dawn, moving slowly through steep basins covered in aspen and spruce. The air was cold, and the frost made the leaves beneath their boots crunch softly. Kyle used cow calls every so often, pausing to listen for a response. They were high in elevation, near 10,000 feet, and already several miles from their tent. They hadn't seen another hunter in 2 days. Kyle knelt beside a fresh elk rub on a thick pine, its bark stripped clean and glistening with sap. Big bull, still close. His heart picked up with that quiet excitement only hunters understood. They pressed deeper into the timber. Around mid-morning, Kyle noticed something odd. The woods had gone completely still. No squirrel chatter, no bird sounds. He didn't say anything to Ryan, but kept scanning the trees more often, his instincts telling him that something had shifted. They continued moving through a winding gully choked with downed trees. The silence grew heavier. It was just past noon when Ryan spotted the tracks. Elk, moving downhill toward a small creek. They decided to follow, spacing out for stealth. Ryan would loop above to try to spot from a ridge, while Kyle trailed the prints through the bottom. The trees closed in tighter here. Kyle moved carefully, using cover, his bow ready. He stepped into a clearing and froze. Across the mud, his eyes locked onto a set of prints that weren't elk. Massive padded tracks with long toes and deep claw marks. Too wide for a mountain lion, too far apart for a black bear. Kyle had seen grizzly prints before on trips north, but never in southern Colorado. There hadn't been a confirmed grizzly in the state for decades. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, watching. He stepped back, eyes sweeping the tree line. Nothing. Still, the unease clung to him. He pulled his radio from his pack and called Ryan, telling him to regroup. No answer. Static. Frowning, he started climbing toward the ridge where Ryan had gone. The higher he climbed, the worse the visibility became. Fog pressed in like a wall. Then he saw it, Ryan's boot prints, but something else was there too, overlapping them, larger. He followed the trail uphill, now moving faster, his bow clutched tightly. A low crack echoed from above. A rock rolled down toward him. He raised his head sharply, peering through the fog. A dark figure moved between the trees, too big and upright to be a bear. It vanished before he could focus. His pulse raced. His breath came in shallow bursts. He moved faster. When he reached the ridgeline, Ryan was nowhere in sight. Kyle called out, his voice tight and urgent. He scanned the ground. More of those strange tracks were everywhere now, circling, doubling back. They weren't just animal tracks. They looked almost human, but not quite. The trees creaked in the wind and a strange odor filled the air. Musky, sour, something dead. He crouched low, listening, every sense straining. Then he heard it, footsteps heavy and deliberate, circling behind him. He turned fast, raising his bow, but nothing was there, just the wall of trees and fog. Kyle's breathing grew ragged. He forced himself to stay focused. He moved downhill again toward a rocky outcrop he had marked earlier as a reference point. Maybe Ryan had doubled back. As he descended, he kept catching movement out of the corner of his eye, branches swaying when there was no wind, fleeting shadows just beyond his vision. Suddenly, a sharp metallic noise rang out. It was Ryan's bear bell, something he kept tied to his pack. Kyle sprinted toward the sound, crashing through the underbrush. The forest closed around him, and then he burst into a clearing. Ryan stood there, pale and wide-eyed, his clothes damp with sweat. He didn't say anything. He just pointed behind them. Kyle turned. At the edge of the fog, just past the trees, something stood watching. Tall, broad, covered in dark hair. Its eyes reflected faint amber light. For a moment, everything stopped. The thing didn't move. Neither did Kyle. Then in an instant it was gone, vanishing into the trees so fast it barely made a sound. Kyle grabbed Ryan's arm and they moved, fast. No more tracking, no more calling. They dropped elevation hard, pushing through thick timber until they hit the creek bottom. They didn't stop until they reached camp, nearly 5 miles from where they'd seen the figure. The Glock had never left Kyle's hand. They packed up in silence, not bothering to wait for daylight the next morning. The whole hike out, Kyle felt it, eyes, watching. Never close enough to see, but always there, the feeling of being hunted. When they reached the trailhead, Kyle finally turned and scanned the tree line one last time. Nothing moved, but the silence lingered, deep and unnatural. A week later, back in town, Kyle checked the trail cam they had set near the creek. It was crushed, the lens cracked, the memory card was gone. He never reported what they saw. No one would have believed it anyway. The official explanation would have said bear or cougar, maybe someone playing tricks in the woods. But Kyle knew better. Whatever had tracked them wasn't just a predator, it was something else. Something that moved through the forest like a ghost, hunting not for food, but for something far more unsettling. He still hunted, but never in those mountains again. Every November, Wade Proctor made a solo mule deer hunt in Utah's mountain range. At 44, he'd been hunting for 3 decades, and solitude wasn't a drawback. It was the point. Rifle season had opened a few days earlier, and Wade packed in from the trailhead with his Tikka T3 chambered in .308, a global positioning system, and 5 days of food. He liked the remoteness. No pressure, no noise. Just him, the cold, and the animals. The first 2 days were quiet. He glassed distant ridges, found tracks near a seasonal creek, and spotted does bedded in the sage. He passed on a decent 3x3 buck, hoping for something bigger. The rut hadn't kicked in yet, but things were picking up. The bucks were starting to move. It wasn't until the 3rd evening that Wade realized something wasn't right. He'd set up on a high bluff to glass a basin when he noticed movement in the trees below. He lifted his binoculars, expecting deer, but saw nothing. The branches had swayed, but no wind followed. Maybe a rabbit, maybe not. He watched longer, eyes sweeping the shadows until the light faded. That night at camp, he built a small fire and cooked dehydrated stew. He kept his rifle close, as always. His shelter was just a tarp slung over paracord between 2 pines, simple and light. At midnight, he woke to something crunching in the leaves. He sat up, heart calm but alert. The fire was out. Moonlight cast faint lines through the trees. He scanned the darkness but saw nothing. The crunching stopped. Morning came cold and sharp. Wade glassed again from the bluff but didn't see anything moving in the basin. Still, he had that prickling feeling, like something was watching. He hiked down into the lower draws to look for fresher sign, checking water holes and brush beds. It was just before noon when he saw it. Deep tracks in the mud beside a narrow creek. Round, wide pad, no claw marks. cougar. Wade crouched beside them. They were fresh, just within the hour. He glanced up at the rimrock, suddenly aware of how exposed his position was. Cougars didn't linger in the open. If it had passed through here, it was likely watching him already. He backed out of the draw and looped uphill, careful to keep checking his six. Nothing followed. Still, the feeling didn't leave him. By late afternoon, he'd returned to camp, uneasy. He made a perimeter check, noting no sign of disturbance. The wind picked up around sunset, hissing through the pines. He barely ate that night, just sat near the fire, rifle across his lap, watching the trees. That night, Wade didn't sleep much. Something moved near the tarp after midnight. Not heavy, not crashing through, just soft, patient steps. Stalking steps. He waited, breath shallow, and thumbed the safety on his rifle. Nothing came close enough to shoot. The next morning, he made a decision. He would hunt one more day, then pack out. His instincts weren't wrong often, and something about this trip felt off. Too quiet, too still, and something was keeping to the shadows. That afternoon, while tracking a set of deer trails over a ridge, he spotted a lone buck feeding near the edge of a rocky clearing. Wide 4-point. He crouched, lined up the shot at 180 yards, exhaled, and fired. The buck dropped instantly. Wade should have felt the usual satisfaction, but he didn't. Something gnawed at the edge of his thoughts. He field-dressed the animal fast, glancing around constantly, then hung the quarters in a nearby tree to cool. It wasn't until the drag back to camp that he realized how alone he was now. No other hunters for miles, no backup. And somewhere out there, a cougar had been tracking him, watching, waiting. By the time he reached camp, the sun was already gone. He stashed the meat in a tree away from the tarp, built a fire, and tried to settle in. But that night, he couldn't sleep at all. The firelight danced, but the shadows stayed still. Too still. Hours passed. Then, just after 2 a.m., something snapped a branch behind the tarp. Wade sprang up, rifle raised. He stepped from the tarp, heart thundering. The fire had dimmed, but in its faint glow, he caught the outline, low to the ground, muscular, silent, pale eyes watching from just inside the tree line. Cougar. It didn't flee when he shouted. It didn't flinch when he stepped forward. It just melted back into the dark, noiseless, like smoke. Wade stayed up the rest of the night, his back to a tree, rifle pointed toward the shadows. But the animal never came close again. At first light, he packed. No breakfast, no coffee, just gear shoved into his frame pack and the meat secured as fast as possible. He wanted out. The hike out was 8 miles, through canyons, over ridges. He kept checking behind him. He moved fast, but quietly. The cougar wasn't done yet. He knew it. He didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but it was there. Just after midday, while crossing a narrow ridge between 2 canyons, he stopped to catch his breath. That's when it lunged. A blur of tan muscle exploded from a rock shelf 10 feet above him. He twisted, just in time to raise the rifle. The cougar crashed into him, claws tearing across his pack and jaws snapping an inch from his neck. He pulled the trigger as they hit the ground. The shot echoed through the trees. The cat thrashed, kicking violently, claws raking his shoulder. He shoved it off and rolled, bringing the rifle up again. The cougar was down, struggling to rise. Blood soaked its chest. He fired once more, then it was still. Wade stood shaking, his arm bled, shallow slices across his shoulder and back. He stared at the cougar for a long time. Big Tom, easily 150 pounds. He had no idea how long it had been shadowing him, maybe days, maybe from the first night. When he finally reached the truck, hours later, the sun was low again. He didn't speak, didn't even take off his gear for a while, just sat behind the wheel, eyes locked on the tree line. He still hunted every fall, but he never hunted mule deer alone again. By late October, the mountains of northwestern Montana were already laced with snow. Tyler Raines, 38, and his cousin Mark Griggs, 42, had drawn backcountry elk tags and packed in deep, 12 miles from the nearest road near the Bob Marshall Wilderness boundary. They both had years of experience hunting elk in cold country and trusted their gear. Tyler carried a .300 Winchester Magnum bolt-action rifle. Mark had a .338 Lapua. Both rifles were zeroed, their scopes clean, their packs stocked with 5 days of food, water filters, and satellite radios. They made camp in a low, wind-sheltered basin right below a ridgeline that held fresh elk sign. Daylight was short and the snow made everything quiet. After the first full day of hiking, glassing, and chasing bugles through the timber, they returned to camp just before dark, exhausted but encouraged. They'd seen 2 bulls across the valley. One was a shooter, heavy, wide, probably a 6x6. That night, while boiling water over their small fire, Mark froze, his head tilted like a predator itself. Then Tyler heard it too, a low howl in the distance, carried faintly on the wind. Wolves. Far off, not unusual. They'd seen prints earlier, but they didn't worry. Wolves didn't bother people. They followed elk, sometimes scavenged kills, but they usually stayed clear of hunters. Still, Tyler instinctively checked that his rifle was within reach before settling into his tent. Around midnight, more howls rose, closer now, then silence. When they woke, the ground around their camp was pocked with tracks. Wolf prints circled wide in the snow, always staying about 30 yards out. Just passing through, they thought. But something about the way the prints circled rather than crossed made Tyler feel uneasy. It felt deliberate, observant. They spent the next day chasing the bulls they'd spotted but couldn't close the distance. The elk were moving fast and not bugling much. Mark said something had them spooked. That night, while gutting a rabbit he'd trapped near camp, Tyler heard rustling in the brush. He turned fast, rifle in hand. Nothing, no tracks, but he felt it. Something was watching. After dinner, they heard the howling again. Closer this time, too close. Both men stood by the fire, rifles in hand, scanning the tree line with headlamps. Eyes reflected back. Just 1 pair at first, then 2, then more. They vanished as quickly as they appeared. Tyler stoked the fire high. Neither of them went to sleep. They sat back to back with their rifles across their laps, eyes darting to every flicker in the dark. At 3 a.m., Mark whispered that he'd seen movement behind the tent. When they checked, fresh prints circled just 20 feet from where they'd been sitting. Still, the wolves hadn't come closer. They were testing them. The 3rd day, they hunted with tension in their shoulders. They didn't hear elk. The forest was too quiet. That afternoon, Mark climbed a rocky outcrop to glass a slope while Tyler checked for fresh sign in a small draw. When Tyler returned, he found Mark standing stiff by the rocks, staring at the snow behind them. More wolf tracks, at least 10 individuals. Some of the biggest prints Tyler had ever seen, and they weren't random. The pack had followed both of them from different directions, tracking their paths like predators stalking prey. When night fell again, the howling started immediately. It came from every direction. The fire crackled louder than usual. Tyler kept his rifle on his knees, eyes wide, teeth clenched. Mark sat across from him, his .338 pointed toward the blackness beyond the firelight. The air felt heavy, thick with pressure, and then they saw it. Movement at the edge of camp. A large wolf stepped from the shadows, bigger than any they'd seen before, almost ghost white, its ribs showing under its matted fur. It stopped just inside the ring of trees, eyes glowing. Tyler raised his rifle, heart hammering, but didn't shoot. It didn't run, it just watched. Then another appeared, farther left. Then another, behind the tents. They were surrounded. Neither man said a word. They knew firing too early could trigger a full charge, but doing nothing felt worse. Tyler slowly stood and tossed more branches into the fire. The flames rose. A 3rd wolf circled behind them. They turned in sync, keeping their rifles up, ears tuned to every snap of a twig. The wolves held the line. No rush, no panic, just waiting. Then something shattered the silence. A blur came low from the right. A wolf darted in, fast and silent, aiming straight for the campfire. Tyler dropped to a knee and fired. The shot echoed like a bomb through the trees. Snow exploded behind the animal. It veered and vanished. Another shot rang out. Mark fired at a second shape, rushing the tents. It missed, but it was enough. The wolves pulled back, melting into the dark. The white one was last to go, its eyes holding for one final second before it vanished. The rest of the night passed in stunned silence. They didn't sleep. They didn't speak. They sat beside the fire until the pale gray of morning. The moment the sun touched the ridgeline, they broke camp fast. There was no discussion, no debate. They packed their gear in under 30 minutes and began the long hike out, dragging the sled with their supplies between them. Every 30 yards, one of them stopped to check the trail behind. 3 miles out, they found more tracks, parallel to theirs. The wolves had followed them, not attacking now, just watching. Still herding. By the time they reached the trailhead, their legs were shaking and their water was gone. But they didn't rest. They loaded the truck and drove straight out of the mountains. Neither man had been attacked, not officially, but both knew what had happened. It hadn't been a misunderstanding. It hadn't been wolves passing through. That pack had hunted them. Ryan Calder, 36, and his longtime friend Mike Breyer, 39, had hunted moose in the river delta on the west coast of Alaska before, but never this deep. That September, they flew in by bush plane and got dropped beside a narrow river east of Bethel. It was cold, overcast, and quiet, perfect conditions. With 2 tags, 2 rifles, and 9 days of supplies, they planned to float downstream and glass the banks for bulls in rut. Ryan carried a .338 Winchester Magnum, and Mike had a .375 Holland & Holland Magnum, more than enough stopping power for moose or anything else. The first few days were what they'd hoped for. Frost-coated mornings, the long howl of loons echoing off the water, and bull moose bugling from across the swampy flats. They passed on a few young bulls and made camp each night on higher ground away from bear sign. There was plenty of it, tracks near the water, claw marks on trees, and old scat, but nothing fresh enough to worry them. That changed on day 5. They'd pulled the raft ashore in a narrow oxbow late that afternoon. The banks were lined with willows, and from the ridge they'd glassed earlier, Ryan had spotted a large bull deep in the brush. They hiked a mile inland with hopes of cutting it off, but as the light faded, they realized they'd overshot it and looped too far south. The terrain was disorienting: thick timber, marshy bottoms, and no clear landmarks. By dusk, they were completely turned around. Ryan checked the global positioning system only to find the screen blank. It had died despite fresh batteries that morning. Mike's compass was buried in his gear somewhere on the raft. They looked at each other without saying anything. A storm was coming, cold wind cutting sideways and the scent of snow in the air. They hiked in the direction they thought was west, hoping to find the river again. It never came. After another hour of pushing through dense brush, soaked to the knees and shivering, they admitted they were lost. They set camp right there, just a tarp, some branches, and a fire started with soaked tinder. They kept their rifles close and packs dry. The night was long, cold, and silent except for the wind and an occasional creak of trees overhead. Around 3 a.m., Ryan heard a branch snap, loud, heavy. He sat up, heart thudding, and scanned the trees. The fire was low, casting orange flickers across the mossy trunks. Mike stirred beside him, but neither spoke. Something moved beyond the reach of the firelight, slow, deliberate steps circling wide. Ryan raised his rifle. Whatever it wasn't a moose. The steps were too quiet, too patient. Then silence again. The next morning they started walking. The sun offered no help. The sky was a dull sheet of gray. No visible peaks, no way to gauge direction. They hiked for hours through thick alder, following what they hoped was a game trail. But by early afternoon they were no closer to the river. Every time they thought they saw a familiar clearing or creek, it turned out to be a different place entirely. That's when they saw the tracks. Fresh. Deep. A bear. There were massive paw prints in the mud beside a marshy wallow with claws like knives. Ryan crouched, touching one with a gloved hand, less than an hour old. The bear was moving in the same direction they were, along the low ridge to their right. They climbed higher, hoping to avoid it, but the feeling of being followed never left. Mike stopped at one point and whispered that he'd seen something behind a tree, just for a second, a shadow that moved wrong. They didn't talk after that, just kept walking, heads on a swivel, rifles ready. That night, they didn't make a fire. The brush was too dry and the wind was too strong. They set camp in a small hollow between spruce trees, draping their tarp low and keeping their rifles in hand. They took turns staying awake. Every hour or so, Ryan swore he heard breathing in the woods. Not wind, not a deer, something big, watching. In the middle of the night, they smelled it, rot, wet fur, musk. Ryan held his breath. Mike stared into the dark, eyes wide. Something moved just beyond the tree line, barely visible, a large shape shifting between trunks. The bear. It wasn't approaching, just watching, circling, waiting. By dawn, they were nearly out of food, and both were shaking from cold and exhaustion. They packed up in silence and pushed north, hoping to climb high enough to spot the river or a landmark. Hours passed. They found nothing. Then they stumbled onto it. A kill site. Fresh moose carcass torn apart, ribs exposed. A back leg was missing. The area reeked of blood and bare. Huge prints circled the body, and nearby they found an area where something had bedded down recently. Too fresh, too close. They backed out slowly, guns raised, scanning the trees. No sounds, no growls, just silence, and the feeling of eyes boring into them. They didn't stop for camp that night. They kept walking, stumbling through the dark with headlamps and frozen feet. They didn't speak. Both knew the bear wasn't done with them. Around midnight, they heard it again, branches breaking behind them, close. Mike turned fast, rifle up, nothing. Then Ryan saw it. The bear stepped between two trees 30 yards back. A massive brown mass, taller than any black bear. Coastal grizzly. Its eyes caught the light for a moment, just enough for Ryan to see it clearly. Broad shoulders, mottled coat, scar across its snout. It stepped forward once. Ryan fired. The shot echoed off the trees. The bear paused but didn't flinch. Then it backed into the woods without a sound. They ran. Tripping, gasping, they stumbled down a shallow ravine and kept moving. At first light, they spotted the river. It was still over a mile away, but they saw it, winding through the lowlands like a silver ribbon. They reached the raft by noon. It was intact. They didn't even load gear. They shoved it off the bank and floated fast, paddling downstream with everything they had. When they finally radioed the pilot for pickup 3 days later, they hadn't seen the bear again. But every time a branch snapped or a shadow shifted along the bank, they flinched. They knew it had followed them. And if they'd stayed one more night, it might not have just watched. Brett Langford, 44, had hunted wild boar in the Arkansas Ozarks every fall for over a decade. He preferred to go solo, just him, his lever action .45, 70, and the endless ridges of hardwood timber. He didn't use dogs, didn't bait. He still hunted slow and silent, tracking hog sign through the brush like his grandfather had taught him. He set out for 3 days deep in a forest that lies in the western portion of Arkansas. He parked his truck near a gated fire road, packed light, just a bedroll, rations, his rifle, a sidearm, and some basic medical supplies. He hiked 6 miles before dusk and made camp near a dry creek bed that twisted through a narrow draw. That night, coyotes yipped far off. An owl hooted close by. Everything felt as it should. By the second day, Brett had found solid sign, rutted soil, saplings snapped chest high, and fresh tracks with deep dew claw marks. Big boar, traveling alone. That's what he was after. He glassed the edge of a thick cedar flat and spotted a large black shape moving low through the brush, tail twitching, rooting at the base of a rotted stump. The boar had tusks that caught the sunlight and a blocky, scarred frame. Brett knew better than to rush it. He looped around, staying downwind, heart pacing steady. He moved slowly, checking every step, finger hovering near the trigger guard. At 50 yards, he had a shot, broadside, just behind the shoulder. He squeezed off a round, the recoil slammed into his shoulder. The boar spun, squealed loudly, and crashed into the brush. Brett waited, kneeling in the leaves, scanning for movement. He'd hit it hard, but not clean enough. No death squeal. He crept forward with his rifle at the ready, his pulse pounding harder with every step. He found blood fast, bright red, sprayed high on the brush. But no boar, just deep gouges in the leaves where it had run. He followed. The trail wound down into a low hollow, thick with undergrowth and deadfall. The boar had plowed through it all, bleeding heavily. Brett kept his rifle up, eyes sharp, listening for any sound that didn't belong. His boots crunched softly over frost-coated leaves. A squirrel barked overhead, then silence. A shadow moved left, way too fast. Then it hit him. The boar exploded from a tangle of brush less than 10 feet away, head low, tusks forward, eyes wild. Brett didn't have time to aim. It slammed into him like a battering ram, knocked him clean off his feet. His rifle flew from his hands as he hit the ground hard, wind crushed from his lungs. The boar was on him, hooves pounding, tusks slashing. Pain lit up his thigh, a sharp, hot stab. He rolled, grabbing at his belt, trying to draw the sidearm. The boar turned, snorting, tusks slick with blood. It charged again. Brett fired blind. The .357 cracked once, then again. The boar squealed, flinched, then crashed into a tree. It staggered, wheeled in the leaves, then bolted into the brush, blood pouring from its side. Brett didn't move. He just lay there, heart hammering, staring at the branches overhead, the sky pale blue beyond. His leg throbbed. Warm blood soaked through his jeans. He finally sat up, gasping, checking the wound. The tusk had torn his upper thigh, deep but not arterial, bad but survivable. He'd seen worse. He dragged himself over to his rifle, still loaded. Then he crawled back to a tree, propped himself up, and forced his belt off to use as a makeshift tourniquet just in case. The forest was dead quiet now. He didn't know where the boar had gone, but it was hit. Twice. He wasn't going to go after it again, not in this state. He pulled out his radio, no signal, too deep in the hills. His pack was back at camp, miles behind. No medical gear, no water, no food. Just the clothes on his back, the rifle, the revolver, and what little strength he had left. He knew he had two choices, stay put and risk infection, or start crawling back toward camp. He chose to move. It took him 2 hours to crawl the first mile. Every root, every rock, every snag felt like it ripped through him. He fashioned a crude crutch from a limb, lashed it tight with bootlaces, and hobbled upright. He could limp slowly, but every step sent lightning through his leg. The sun dropped fast, casting long shadows over the woods. He kept going. Coyotes howled nearby. At dusk, he finally reached his camp. A fire ring, a tarp stretched between trees, his pack hanging from a branch. He fell to the ground beneath it, breathing in dirt and pine needles. He cleaned the wound with iodine from the kit, wrapped it tight with gauze and duct tape, and boiled water to sterilize his knife in case things got worse. He ate jerky in silence, listening. The woods were still now. The boar was long gone or dead somewhere. He didn't sleep that night. Fever came quick. Sweats, chills, dizziness. But he made it to morning. The wound hadn't worsened. He packed his gear and hobbled the full 6 miles back to his truck by late afternoon, resting often, rifle always in hand. Every rustle in the brush made his heart leap. He didn't see another boar, just birds and one deer. By the time he reached the truck, his leg was stiff and swollen and his face pale. He drove straight to the nearest clinic where they cleaned and stitched the wound, 22 stitches in all. No nerve damage, no infection. The doctor told him he was lucky. He didn't feel lucky. He felt awake, grateful, and respectful of the boar, the woods, and what it meant to walk alone that far into a country where prey could turn to predator in an instant. He never recovered that boar. But every year after, when he hunted the Ozarks, he kept one eye on the brush and his hand a little closer to the grip.